Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 5, Not Your World. Not Your World. The long, bucolic stillness of the circular pond shattered when Serpendis Endium, world-renowned adventurer merchant of Coast Haven, Canania, erupted through the water's surface, gasping for breath. He flailed for a while, casting violent waves at the green grasses and standing stones of the water's edge around him. He then swam toward the muddy shore composed of tall, feathery reeds, pale green shoots, and large, brightly colored water plants. He threw his hands onto the soft, warm grass, dug his fingers in, and strained with all his remaining strength to pull himself out of the water, to no avail. As he closed his eyes from absolute exhaustion and began to slide back into the water, two hands grabbed his wrists with fierce, sinewy strength and pulled him completely out of the water, letting his hands fall back to the fresh grass. Its sweet smell mingled with rich earth filled his sinuses and instantly pulled him back to his childhood, playing with friends on freshly cut lawns of his family's farm on the outskirts of Dolgethad in the realm of Erendor, one of Canania's 7 cities and 5 realms. He rolled around onto his back and opened his eyes, waiting for the pounding in his ears to run its course. Standing above him, shadowed by the glare of the blazing sun high overhead, was an unfamiliar figure, seemingly female according to his immediate observation. The figure then turned and walked away, her soft footfalls receding into the distance. Before he could speak or react, he felt a hard tug on the rope around his neck that almost spun him around and dragged him back into the water. He grabbed the rope and pulled while kicking his bare feet, trying to anchor himself from the pond. Slowly emerging from the water came 2 antlers, followed by drenched, black, braided hair and Piecora's dark and deeply tanned face, her oily silagen ink running down her face from the strange divergent pressures of the water portal she just traveled through. Strapped over her face, covering her nose and mouth, was a strange breathing apparatus composed of a large mollusk incorporated with crustacean aspects, with soft, fleshy, bright red external amphibian gills waving gently on both sides. In one hand, she held the tattered end of the rope. In the other was a hunting knife. Behind her, Hero burst from the surface of the pool like a spear, his wings unfolding to gain flight while his momentum carried him upward. He then dropped sharply and landed on the soft grass beside Serpendis, his large legs and feet bearing the brunt of the fall. He held his wings outstretched, and his feathers bristled as he dried himself in the gentle breeze. Piecora laboriously pulled herself out of the water and flopped on the grass beside Serpendis, breathing heavily through her apparatus. The gills on the thing flickered and buzzed outwardly like a Canonian party toy as she exhaled and receded when she inhaled. It had a strange, briny smell that reminded Serpendis of Coast Haven, and the sound of her gasping breath had an otherworldly aerated sound as it filtered through the device's internal membranes. Finally, she pulled the strange thing off her face and let it rest beside her. Marks around her mouth and nose lingered from where the respirator made contact with her skin. Still gasping for breath, she said, "What did I tell you?" A rise of indignation threatened to overtake Serpendis's mixed emotions and fears at her question, but then he realized he had no strength to care. "Don't go into the mountains," he mumbled quietly. He waited for her reprimand, but it never came. Instead, after several moments of catching her breath, she asked simply, "Where are we?" "We are dead," he rasped, "and our souls have arrived in Book, home of the gods, Olympia, the world of our—" "No, not your world," she said flatly, interrupting him while waving a hand in denial. Our soul would not visit your gods when we die. There's another destination for us. He turned to his side to face her. She had just risen up from lying on her back to lean on her elbows, and she looked around their surroundings through squinted eyes and furrowed brows. Oily Silogen ink slowly crawled down her face, warping their designs in all directions. Her clothes and gear were soaked completely through, and her hair reminded Serpendis of the black fishing nets of Coast Haven's docks, some of it caught up in her antlers. Who do you mean when you say us, with regard to your soul? He asked. She did not respond right away, but instead continued gazing all around her, seemingly lost and confused. But then she looked at him as if finally registering his question, and she grinned, as if embarrassed by an answer she wasn't sure she was allowed to give. He was about to ask what she found amusing, but she suddenly spoke after deliberating it in her mind. Hierro and I share the same soul, she said. We are connected in this way, and we are very lucky to have found each other, especially while we are young. Most of us never find our other half, our soul bond, wandering listlessly in the world, half realized, half awake, half aware of who we are. We see, hear, and think as one. Our soul is one. It is reunited. Her eyes became distant, her face a grimaced stone tablet containing generations of information Serpendis knew he wouldn't understand. He wondered about the complicated thoughts seemingly moving behind that mask and decided to change the subject for now in favor of another immediate curiosity. How did you find me? He asked. Hierro and I tracked you from the camp right into the mountains I told you not to enter, and now you understand why. Mountains in the wildlands contain many dangers and secrets. Things live in them that are better left alone. As they are always moving, I am never certain which ones are where. This is why nothing is named in the wildlands. What would be the point? She continued after a moment. It turns out you stumbled into the emerald farms of hollow elves. They live very far below the surface of the world, further down than we can comprehend. But they use the mountains to harvest their gems, which they plant in the deepest regions of their realm. Pressures in the underworld push the gems up near the surface after many long years, and the hollow elves come up and harvest them when they are ready. You found such a bounty. Lucky you, eh? He looked at her quizzically while she squeezed water out of her thick braids. The hollow elves? Gwagorbanog, vile, horrible creatures of the underworld. They harvest more than just gems while they are near the surface. They lure anyone passing by with their songs right into their midst. The victims are captured and dragged down to their realm along with their gem harvest. They would have enslaved you and used you for every ounce of your life until there was nothing left, and you never would have seen light again. But you came after me, he said weakly, unable to comprehend why she would throw herself into such horrific danger for an old man who only showed her contempt. Why would you? Because you are my charge, and this is what I do, she said bluntly. I am nothing if I am unable to bring you home. Serpendis unexpectedly reached his hand to hers and squeezed, suddenly overcome with emotions that he rarely felt in his life. Surprised, she almost recoiled from him, but she looked down at his hand covering hers and remained, although her look was unreadable. I am a terrible man, you know. He struggled with the words as tears welled in his eyes and blended with the water dripping from his face and hair. Everything. Everyone died. Everyone in my charge. I let them all die on the plains. None of them are returning home because of me and my ignorance. I knew nothing of the meaning of the ink markings until you explained them, nothing of their culture, nothing of what we were getting into. I thought I could just work it all out. It is my fault. It is all my fault. And now I am the only one living to carry this unbearable burden. I am not worth your charity, your sacrifice." He began to sob uncontrollably as a wellspring of immense shame billowed from depths long forgotten within him. He felt her hand grip his hand in response with unexpected strength, and she tenderly laid her other hand over his, catching him off guard. Her hands were not smooth like most women he met in Canania. These were working hands, capable as tools and weapons. "We are all complex creatures, malleable, corruptible, salvageable," she said. "I do not fully know you, merchant, nor the tale of your life. I merely judge you by who you give to me. And so I say, you are an old fool, Lord Serpendis, master merchant of Coast Haven, but I am not perfect either. None of us are ideal, but we are all worth saving." Her words struck his exposed nerves like wind on a dandelion, and his biases dispersed in all directions. He marveled at her as if seeing her from a different angle, now and forevermore. He was lost for words, unable to imagine his ignorance only moments earlier. Even her Sienian accent, when speaking Low Canonian, now seemed charmed with unassailable simplicity, truth, and honesty, when before it only chafed in his ears. He suddenly found that he adored her as a favored niece or daughter, despite their many differences. "You are like family to me now, you know," he said to her, regaining his senses. "If we make it to Canania, you will always be welcome in my home, and my people will tend to your every need. In fact, I shan't accept it if we do not meet while you are visiting our country." He trailed off as it finally occurred to him that Piecora, his Sienjan guide, had no idea where they were, and this realization filled him with an existential concern that muted all other thoughts in his mind. He was now fully aware of the feasibility that he would never see his home again. Thus, promising her his wealth and hospitality seemed completely meritless now. Around the pond, a soft carpet of lush, green, short grass swayed gently beneath the cresting sun. No discernible stream or river fed the pond, as if its only source was the aquifer beneath the ground that Serpendis and Piecora emerged from. Beyond the grass to the north, the lands rose and fell in gentle rolling hills all the way to the horizon. To the east and south loomed a forest of gigantic oak trees, thick and gnarled with exposed roots, branches, and vines, the size of archways found in Canonian cities, with drapes of thick hanging moss and clusters of huge mushrooms, toadstools, and various other strange fungal entities grew from the base of the trees, web-like patterns of white and multi-hued lichen caked on massive twisting trunks and exposed boulders. Surrounding the pool, as if he were seeing them for the first time, protruded 12 weathered standing stones, about as large as children, with symbols and runes carved into them. Around the stones was an outer ring of mushrooms, the smaller normal kind found everywhere in the world that he understood. Apothecary friends in Coast Haven would love this place, he thought to himself. The sky began at the horizon as vibrant gold graduating to infinite cerulean blue at its apex, and there the sun, large and omnipresent overhead, bathed all of the lands in piercing, majestic light, filtering through the southeastern primeval trees like vertical pillars of some ephemeral fey court. Strange sounds reached Serpendis's ears from the forest with piercing clarity, which made Serpendis suddenly wonder if his hearing had somehow improved. The air was warm and pleasant, with a gentle breeze and a subtle, refreshing scent that revitalized his senses. A light mist appeared over the surface of the pool as it returned to stillness. It felt like the perfect Dolgitadan summer to Serpendis, and strangely, the trials and horrors of his expedition to the Banwa seemed like a distant memory. "Those are druid stones," Piecora said slowly, looking at the surrounding standing stones. "I have heard curious tales about them, people going missing, and some returning with great age, or returning many years later, but without aging a day." She stood up and surveyed the area around them, raising her hand to shield her eyes from the sun. "Children going missing, never to return, or returning but aged as if all grown up. I need a better look around," she said. At that moment, Hero took off from his perch and flew straight up, beating hard with his sharp, angular wings. Serpendis heard his wing beats and puffs of breaths as Hero strained to gain altitude. Serpendis rose from the ground, but then almost fell over from how unexpectedly easy it was, and without the usual effort required. Gone was his fatigue, the pain in his joints and back. His arthritic hands and fingers were now loose and flexible like a teenager's. His lungs felt fresh and full. His limbs had strength he hadn't felt since his early 20s, he surmised. Piecora caught his arm and steadied him, her eyes watching him, but also twitching elsewhere, as if preoccupied with a view of something else. His robes hung heavily on his skinny body like wet rags, but they didn't weigh him down like before. His senses were more alive and receptive than he could ever remember, absorbing everything around him with almost painful clarity. He realized all the colors here were drenched and saturated, as if conceived from pure pigment, and the sounds were crisp and immediate, with fullness of range in his ears. He could smell the fertile soil beneath the grass, the purity of the crystalline water in the pond, and the rich bouquet of vegetation where the water met the grass. From the forest in the southeast came a husky, organic, thick smell suffused with great age and primal power that he could almost taste, and from the northwestern hills and plains came the shifting scents of winds and grasses from great distances. He slowly returned her look, then gleefully smiled with a haggard laugh and dirty teeth that were otherwise perfect. "Do you feel this too? This vigor? I feel as if I have regained my youth. Nay, better. I've never felt so alive." He spun around jubilantly, but she caught his arm again, steadying him. "Be wary," she cautioned through gritted teeth. "I feel it too, but I do not trust it. Stay your excitement for now. I do not know where we are, nor do I know the way back from here." "Bah! Wrest from an old man his renewed vitality, will you?" he said jovially, his voice cracking. He felt drunk from this new discovery and a little maniacal from the circus of emotions he had so quickly experienced so far. He also now felt a closeness with her that evaporated his previous inhibitions. He saw her as a friend now. "I should push you back into the pool, back into those tunnels. Get you gone, girl! Ha 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 ha!" He laughed while pulling away from her, spinning around on his gangly legs with his arms spread wide. But Piecora's eyes were seeing overland great distances through Hero now, soaring high overhead and mapping their surroundings. The nearby forest was dense, dark, impenetrable, and went on to the horizon in the southeast. To the northwest stretched nothing but hills and grass. Something bothered Hiro, and being in his mind, she felt the agitation of the overabundant stimulation of this realm that so excited Serpendis, and that she herself felt. This intense aura overwhelmed Hero's highly tuned senses, and she felt him teetering on madness as he flew so high above them. She quickly let go of his mind, but not before noticing a curtain of cloudy darkness on the horizon in the west that wasn't there a moment ago. She bade him to find cover in the forest and return to herself. "I know we have found Book of Urm now," Serpendis proclaimed as he spun and cartwheeled with almost religious fervor. "We have found the realm of the gods, Dolg, Apollo. Can you hear me? Hermes, you devil, where are you? I served both of you well when I was mortal. Not at the same time, of course, but you understand me. Itches and scratches and all that. We all play our role in the primal world, but here we are now. We are equals now. Come out and show us where we spend the rest of eternity." Hero folded his wings and dove from his great height into the forested canopy with precision only his kind had mastered. Piecora looked with her own eyes into the west just as she felt the wind pick up from the same direction, carrying the musty smell of swollen clouds and heavy rains. The temperature dropped noticeably, and she saw flickering arcs of lightning crackling here and there within the dark amber and violet curtain of the oncoming storm. She couldn't believe how quickly it had gained on them. Running to Serpendis, she grabbed her knife, spun him around to face her, and immediately began cutting at the rope around his neck. "Ah, the daughter I never—" Serpendis saw the look of wild fear in her face as she gestured toward the west. Looking up, he saw the storm for the first time towering over them and reaching into the heavens, nearly overcoming the sun. Great shades of darkness, where the temperatures sunk to below half of those in the light, slaked across the nearby hills as emissarial gloom before the storm, while dissolving shafts of weakening sunlight strafed and flickered through the tumultuous winds before blotting it out completely. Lightning of many hues creased the umbral darkness silently, like cracks in the firmament of Empyrean discord. Serpendis froze in fear at the primordial presence suddenly upon them as Piecora ripped the shredded noose from his neck. The sun disappeared behind the boiling clouds overhead, and the wind suddenly hit them with enough physical force to steal the air from their lungs. Her hair became an unmoored living thing in the wind, with whipping tendrils of braids and wild, shifting sheets of loose hair. She grabbed his hand and shouted into his face, but her voice was drowned by the oncoming celestial storm. A sudden deafening blast of adjacent thunder shook the ground beneath his feet, and he snapped out of his stupor to discover Piecora was tugging him along toward the forest. Realizing this immediate plan, he poured energy into his legs and ran like he had never run before, his wet robe flailing in all directions, clinking and rattling with its hidden treasures, leaving Piecora behind him. The first drops of rain the size of melons came down like a barrage of artillery, heavy, large, and deceptively slow, moving like trebuchet projectiles launched from an invading sky-bound Elysian army, sending them both sprawling into the murky, humid depths of the great forest. They found shelter beneath a large mushroom, the color of overcooked salmon, a network of eerie luminescent veins incorporated into its large cap. Concussive winds pounded the outer trees and howled between their great limbs and trunks, lifting and sending debris flying in all directions into the swaying canopy above. Huge, heavy clots of rain the size of wagons, with enough water to fill a pool, smashed against the forest's exterior, crashing through the upper reaches of the canopy and snapping boughs and branches with explosive force. Torrents of water mixed with heavy tree limbs and leaves, the size of tavern tables, fell all around them with ear-shattering devastation. Serpendis saw that Piecora held Hero in her chest with both arms, like carrying a child. Hero's head swiveled in all directions, his mouth open wide, but Serpendis could hear no sounds except for the ongoing avalanche around them. With a great tearing sound overhead, a low-ranging and powerful wind current rose up suddenly and tore the top of the mushroom off as if it were wet clay. It sailed away into the upper reaches of the forest. Serpendis and Piecora stared in horror at their disappearing shelter as they were blasted by an amalgam of water from above with such force and gravity that it would have carried Piecora out of the forest if it weren't for Serpendis grabbing her arm while latching himself to a thick, hanging vine suspended from an overhanging tree root. He held his breath in the waterfall as the cascade continued for several more moments, clinging to both vine and his companion. When it finally let up, he saw Piecora lying flat in the mud, covered in detritus, her arm still in his hand. Quickly, he pulled her up to him, amazed at his newfound strength. Hero landed on his shoulder without piercing him with his talons, mouth open wide and screeching, but his call was drowned by the deafening storm. Piecora coughed up water as she fell beside Serpentis, exhausted and drenched. Her hair was a writhing inkblot of saturated braids held together by her skewed antler headpiece. All around them, the forest both sheltered them from the storm and threatened to smash them from its own collapsing infrastructure. Serpentis felt the sleeve of his robe yanked hard. Turning around to look, he came face to face with a female of elven kind, gripping a sapling anchored by a nearby root. Her face was a smooth, soft countenance, textured by large purple and pink freckles and fractal patterns of skin discoloration. Her large oval eyes contained deep, violet pupils, set in kaleidoscopic violet and turquoise retinas surrounded by pure white sclerae. She wore layered cloths of deep blue and burgundy wrapped around her waist that flowed in ribbons around her exposed legs. Pieces of bone hung around her neck. Her dark violet hair was short and grew upward and outward. Her ears were long and pointed, bending slightly outward from the sides of her head. Most notably, however, were the black designs covering her exposed arms, legs, hands, feet, and face. Serpentis's mind ignited with fear, and his mouth went bleached bone dry as he recognized her as a Banwa elf maiden. His recent rejuvenation drained from his body as he withered from the Banwa's intense gaze. He wondered suddenly and whimsically if he had been targeted by the fates, chosen to be a plaything for their sadistic amusement. He imagined these titanic powers, older than the gods, finding sustenance in his fear and anxiety, and him powerless to do anything about it. The Banwa maiden tugged on his sleeve again and shouted something that he could not hear, but it was clear that she beckoned him to follow her. He pulled Piecora up, steadied her on her legs as another limb from the canopy crashed right beside them, and he let the elf escort them beneath the massive, overhanging root above them. But instead of passing all the way through to the other side, she ducked to the left, while in the shadow of the large root, where Serpentis saw an opening at the base of another nearby towering oak tree whose trunk was the size of the Coast Haven State House. The hole's opening was at the juncture of two large roots, the size of horse carts branching out from the base of the great oak's trunk. Here, the elf led Serpentis and Piecora beneath the roots into the base of the tree where Serpentis was overcome with the smell of wet soil, tree bark, and rich, earthy mulch. The hole was small, able to fit only one of them at a time, and its walls were soft, moist, and crumbly. The environment inside was hot and humid. Above and behind them, the storm continued to pummel the forest, but the sounds of destruction became muted once they entered the tree. A quick bend to the right, and Serpentis found himself in a small chamber lit by several short, wide candles of crude bricks of wax. Furs with patterns of creatures he could not recognize lined the floor. It was warm in here, musty, but not uncomfortable, as the air traveled upwards from the tunnel they emerged from and through a hole in the domed ceiling's chamber. Around the tree's inner walls and ceiling hung various skulls and bones that stood eerily still, as neither they nor the candles were agitated by the storm, even though he could still hear it pounding against the giant tree's impenetrable exterior. The Banwa female removed her knee boots, wrapped in strips of blue dyed cloth and tanned leather, and walked onto the furs with bare feet. She then turned to face Serpentis. "Niskanska Chekirkalu Pawikaturkal," she said, scowling, balling her hands into fists. She carried no weapons that he could see, nor could he identify any in the chamber. For all its furnishings, it seemed to Serpendis that this place served more as an encampment and less a home. There's just a certain feeling one gets when entering someone's home, an abstraction of enduring comfort and identity. This place felt rather like a waypoint to him, perhaps one of many that this elf had set up throughout the forest. Serpendis did not understand what she said, but identified the language as some form of elvenkind. His mind raced as perspiration trickled down the sides of his drenched face. He was exhausted, soaked to the bone, and his knees rattled from fatigue. Although it was very warm in the chamber, he was freezing inside, and it was hard for him to pin any thoughts together. But then from behind him, he heard Piecora say weakly, "I know that voice." Emerging from around him and leaning heavily on her hands on his shoulders, Piecora mumbled something that sounded like Karu-E to his ears. Serpendis saw the elf maiden's expression transform into shock. Her mouth fell open, and her eyes became so wide they seemed to emit a light of their own. Speaking in the same strain of elvenkind he heard moments earlier, she strode towards them with arms stretched in front of her in a way that reminded him of his old grandmother when he visited her as a child. The elf even expressed the same nurturing, furrowed brow, and Serpendis braced despite himself for an exceptionally long and tight hug. But much to Serpendis's surprise and relief, all her attention went to Piecora, and the elf embraced her just as Piecora collapsed into her arms. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.